When Tom Watson curled the ball into the back of the net in the 95th minute of the Championship playoff final last week, he sent the Sunderland half of Wembley Stadium into raptures. Following 8 long seasons outside of the Premier League, including 4 stuck in the doldrums of League One, being turned into a punchline by incompetent owners and a Netflix series, and forced to watch Donald Love for 3 years, Sunderland, a club with as many top-flight league titles as Chelsea and a higher average attendance, had won promotion back to the big time in the best way possible. The fact that it was a 19-year-old academy graduate who clinched it for them only made it all the more special. Watson's goal guaranteed Sunderland more than £200 million in revenue, the return of the Tyne-Wear derby, and a seat at the top table of English football, where Sunderland sit 10th in the league's all-time table. But once the celebrations die down for Sunderland, reality will begin to dawn. The stark fact is that of the last 15 teams to have won promotion from the Championship, only 5 have managed to survive in the Premier League. Out of the last 6 teams to win promotion, so that is, every team promoted in the last 2 seasons, all of whom won more points in the Championship than the Black Cats, not a single one has survived. In fact, not only have the 3 promoted teams each come straight back down in the last 2 Premier League seasons, they have come straight back down with a whimper. Luton, Burnley and Sheffield United set a record for the fewest points won by the 3 promoted teams when they came back down with a combined 66 points last season, but Ipswich, Leicester and Southampton, 3 teams who were superb in the Championship, fared even worse this season, breaking that record and plummeting back down to the Championship with their tails between their legs and just 59 points between them. That is the same number of points that Leeds United won a few years ago as a newly promoted club on their own. Sheffield United, who were promoted with 91 points the season before last, became the 3rd worst team of the Premier League era last season, relegated with just 16 points. Meanwhile, Southampton, who won 87 points in the Championship, came straight back down with only 12 points to their name this season, narrowly avoiding breaking Derby's record as the worst Premier League team of all time. Without wanting to pee on Sunderland's parade, which it feels a bit like I'm doing, there will be those who consider avoiding breaking that unwanted record to be their primary aim next season, rather than actually staying in the division, which rapidly appears to be a pipe dream for newly promoted clubs, owing to the gigantic economic and sporting chasm that has emerged between the first and second tiers of English football. And yet, the season before Luton, Burnley and Sheffield United's disaster classes, all 3 newly promoted teams, Fulham, Bournemouth and Nottingham Forest, not only survived in their first seasons back in the Premier League, but haven't been relegated since then, and finished 7th, 9th and 11th this season, all 3 of them well clear of a third of the division's so-called Big Six. So just what on earth is going on then? Has Premier League survival actually become impossible for newly promoted clubs? If the answer is yes, then how did that new reality seemingly take shape so suddenly? And is there a realistic way of fixing the problem both of newly promoted Premier League teams going straight back down and newly relegated Championship teams coming straight back up? Well, funnily enough, that is what today's video is all about. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to the gap between the Premier League and the Championship, an area which is seemingly larger than Russia and is growing faster than the list of redundancies at Manchester United, as we take a closer look at whether the Premier League has effectively abolished relegation. It is possible to take a look at each of the teams who have won promotion to the Premier League and come straight back down in isolation, and identify mistakes that might have been made, or where things went wrong for them along the way. Leicester obviously overspent, particularly on wages from the COVID season onwards, amassing the largest wage bill outside of the Big Six, with only the 14th highest revenue, sustaining consistent heavy losses and running into regulatory trouble as a result, preventing them from strengthening as they would have liked ahead of their return to the Premier League, during what was already a difficult summer, in which their title-winning Championship boss Enzo Maresca and star man Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall both left the Foxes to join Chelsea. Ipswich had no such financial or regulatory headaches, following back-to-back promotions from League One to the Premier League, actually becoming the 2nd highest spending newly promoted team of all time, behind Nottingham Forest, after forking out around £130 million. £100. But the step up from the third to the first tier in just 2 seasons, and attempting to integrate more than 10 new signings in a single season, proved to be a task too great even for Kieran McKenna, especially with what was still the lowest wage bill in the division. Southampton, meanwhile, also spent more than £100 million, the fourth most in the history of newly promoted clubs, but not unlike Burnley last season under Vincent Kompany, manager Russell Martin was accused of attempting to play an overly ambitious style of passing football, which included taking several risks when playing out from the back, where mistakes were ruthlessly punished by teams with bigger budgets and better players than themselves. All of those may be valid criticisms and observations, but when there is a pattern as strong as the one among newly promoted Premier League teams, it seems to be, at best, rather incomplete to hone in solely upon individual errors or misfortune. In the first 30 years of the Premier League, all 3 promoted teams only ever went down once. That was in the 1997-98 season, when Bolton, Barnsley and Crystal Palace all went straight back down, after winning promotion from what was then known as the First Division. In fact, in the entire history of the Football League having multiple divisions, predating the Premier League and going back some 130 years, that was still the only time that all 3 promoted teams had ever been relegated. Even then, Bolton were only relegated on goal difference, tied on 40 points with Everton, who conceded 5 goals fewer than them over the season as a whole. Barnsley amassed 35 points, and even last-placed Palace won 33 points, which would have been comfortably enough to keep all 3 in the Premier League over the last 2 seasons. None of the last 6 newly promoted Premier League teams, by contrast, have won more than 26 points. In Europe's other Big 5 leagues, all of the promoted teams haven't been relegated from the Bundesliga since the 1992-93 season, the same year in which the Premier League was founded. It has only ever happened once in Serie A, in the 1985-86 season, once in La Liga, all the way back in 1966-67, and it has, quite literally, never happened in Ligue 1. For all 3 newly promoted teams to be relegated with record low combined points tallies in successive seasons is absolutely abnormal, therefore, not just in an English context, but in any major league. If you look at the combined points tallies of the 3 promoted clubs, in every 20-team Premier League season, in which 3 teams have been promoted to the top flight, starting in the 1996-97 season, which I have painstakingly illustrated in this quite beautiful graph for you all, it is clear to see that, whilst there was some volatility from season to season based upon the individual strengths and weaknesses of the promoted clubs, as you would expect, there wasn't a great deal of fluctuation overall for 15 years between the 96-97 and the 11-12 seasons. The combined points tallies of the promoted clubs only dropped below 100 in the 2007-08 season, and that was almost solely down to the previous season's Championship playoff final winners Derby County becoming the worst Premier League team of all time and only amassing 11 points. The other 2 promoted clubs, Sunderland and Birmingham, despite the latter also getting relegated, actually won more points than the 3 promoted teams combined in either of the last 2 seasons. From the 2012-13 season onwards, there was a slight decline in the competitiveness and therefore the number of points won by the promoted clubs, but that really starts to accelerate from the first COVID season onwards, encompassing the last 5 seasons, in which the 2022-23 season, when all 3 newly promoted clubs survived, stands out like a sore thumb. Having only ever amassed fewer than 100 points once, in that 2007-08 season, solely because of how abject Derby were, the newly promoted teams have failed to hit the 100-point mark in all but one of the last 5 seasons, and there has been a truly spectacular decline over the last 2 seasons, in which they haven't even come close. Up until 5 years ago, the average number of points won by the 3 newly promoted teams consistently hovered around the 40-point mark, which was used for decades as the benchmark for Premier League survival. In the 2000 to 2001 season, the average peaked at over 50 points, which is 8 points more than Manchester United won this season. In the last 2 seasons, that average has plummeted to just 22, and, this season, fewer than 20 points. A couple of years ago, 20 points would make you the 6th worst Premier League team of all time. This season, that was the average number of points amassed by the 3 promoted clubs. It is a worrying trend which not only threatens but, at this stage, I would argue, has already seriously undermined the concept of a Football League pyramid, which is the entire bedrock upon which English football has been built for well over 100 years, and without which, the hopes and dreams of the supporters of the vast majority of football clubs in this country are effectively dead. Thankfully, 7-time Premier League title winner Roy Keane has a solution. Take it away, Roy.
The teams who've come up to have to make a better effort.
Bastards. Why didn't any of the newly promoted teams think of that? Just make a better effort. It's so simple, yet so effective. Clearly, when Ipswich, Southampton and Burnley all forked out more than £100 million in their first seasons back in the big time, they just weren't making enough of an effort. But how exactly do you make a better effort, Roy?
I don't know what else they can do, Roy, in respect of, unless you can
Be harder to beat. Harder to beat.
Brilliant. It's genius. This is the big mistake that Kieran McKenna and Steve Cooper made. They just didn't think to make their teams harder to beat. They obviously set their teams up to be easy to beat, which was foolish, because if they'd just made them a bit harder to beat, they probably wouldn't have lost as many games, and then they would have won more points. Anyway, I'm glad we sorted that mess out. Thank you all as ever for watching No, not really. It is possible, unlikely but possible, that there may be some more deep-rooted issues leading to the seeming impossibility of Premier League survival, which go beyond teams not making enough of an effort or being harder to beat. The most obvious is finances. The Premier League is a behemoth, now in a world of its own within world football, and whilst that is a problem for every league outside of England, hence the push for a Super League in order to compete financially in some quarters, it is also a problem for the English Football League pyramid, where only a tiny fraction of the Premier League's wealth trickles down to the EFL and non-league. Everybody who follows English football knows this instinctively, but I don't think that the sheer gulf between the finances of the Premier League and the Championship are always fully appreciated. Premier League revenue between the league's 20 clubs climbed to more than £6 billion in the 2022-23 season, compared to less than £1 billion between the 24 teams in the Championship. That is an average of £305 million versus less than £40 million, but even that is greatly distorted by the power of parachute payments. The average revenue of Championship clubs who haven't recently been relegated from the Premier League, and therefore aren't in receipt of parachute payments, is just £22.4 million. That is barely 7% of the average Premier League team's revenue, and just 3% of the league's highest earning clubs. Almost every Premier League team has a bench warmer who costs them in excess of £22 million, yet that is the entire annual revenue of the average non-parachute payment Championship club. It is also roughly a third of the average revenue among Championship clubs who are in receipt of parachute payments, and even less when it comes to those in their first season following relegation. Leeds United, Leicester City and Southampton, the three newly relegated clubs, had revenue of £128, £105 and £85 million in the Championship last season, which is between almost 4 to 6 times as much as their Championship rivals, who aren't in receipt of parachute payments. Nonetheless, Championship clubs in receipt of parachute payments still earn, on average, over £18 million less, or less than half as much, as the lowest earning Premier League clubs. It is for that reason that not only are newly promoted clubs incredibly likely to get relegated, newly relegated clubs are also incredibly likely to win promotion, distorting both the bottom end of the Premier League and the top end of the Championship. The gulf between the Premier League and the Championship, partially but nowhere near wholly levelled out by parachute payments, has effectively created a new tier of clubs who are far too good and far too rich for most of the Championship, but nowhere near good or rich enough to actually compete in the Premier League. Yo-yo clubs have long been a feature of the English game, particularly during the parachute payments era, but never previously to this extent. Burnley, for example, won 101 and 100 points in the Championship, only losing 5 games across 2 of the strongest seasons in the history of the division, either side of finishing 19th in the Premier League, in which they only won 5 games and 24 points, in what would have, until very recently, been among the worst Premier League seasons of all time. If we look at other teams to have won promotion from the Championship with more than 100 points historically, and there had only previously been 5 of them. Fulham finished 14th in the Premier League the following season on 44 points in 01-02. Leicester also finished 14th on 41 points in 14-15. Newcastle finished 12th on 46 points in 10-11. Sunderland finished 7th on 58 points in 99-2000. And Reading finished 8th on 55 points in 06-07. There is absolutely no precedent for teams being as good in the Championship as Leicester, Burnley and Ipswich in the last couple of years, and subsequently as hopeless in the Premier League. If you want to stay in the Premier League now, which I would imagine all promoted clubs do, despite what Roy Keane seems to think, you obviously have to displace one of the league's existing 17 clubs. So strong in the middle of the Premier League now, however, this season for example, for either Leicester, Ipswich or Southampton, that would have meant finishing above Tottenham, the 9th richest club in the world and Europa League winners, who will compete in the Champions League next season, since Spurs were the team who finished 17th on 38 points. Tottenham's annual revenue is higher than that of all 24 Championship clubs combined, minus parachute payments. Even if you argue that this season was anomalous, in 2 of the Big 6 performing quite so poorly in the Premier League, although that too is becoming more of a trend, owing to the wealth and strength of the league as a whole, just take a club like West Ham, who spent most of this season hovering between 14th and 17th, and who would therefore, traditionally, have been the type of club that a newly promoted team might have targeted finishing above. West Ham have the 2nd highest average attendance in English football, and the 9th highest in the world, the 17th highest revenue on the planet at over €300 million, above last season's Bundesliga title winners Bayer Leverkusen, and this season's Serie A title winners Napoli, and they boast attacking options which include the likes of Lucas Paquetá, Mohamed Kudus, and Jared Bowen. That is the benchmark that we're talking about pretty much when it comes to Premier League survival for a newly promoted club who, in the case of this season's playoff winners Sunderland for example, may have revenue of less than £40 million the previous season and an entire first team squad which costs less than £20 million to assemble. We're not just talking about 2 different leagues in terms of the Premier League and the Championship, we are talking about 2 entirely different stratospheres. Leeds United's top scorer and best player last season, or at least one of their 2 best players, Crescencio Somerville, who scored 21 goals for them, which is more, incidentally, than any of their players scored in their title-winning campaign this season, scored a grand total of 1 goal in 22 games as a bit-part player at West Ham this season. Those are the levels, and that is the gulf in class that we're talking about. The 3 promoted teams last season, Leicester, Ipswich and Southampton, as well as Leeds who just missed out, were all exceptional Championship sides. Yet they were the worst promoted trio in the history of the Premier League, and English football's top flight as a whole. I'm not sure that the same can be said of this season's promoted trio, Leeds, Burnley and Sunderland, all of whom my team, Hull City, who were honestly dreadful this season, managed to take points against. I don't think that Leeds are better than Leicester, that Burnley are better than Ipswich, or that Sunderland are better than Southampton, none of which bodes particularly well for any of them next season, and which is why I thoroughly expect, for the 3rd season in a row, even though I hope that I'm wrong, all 3 promoted clubs to come straight back down. Whereas in the past, promoted teams often had a shot at survival because a more established Premier League team might spontaneously combust, those types of implosions are so rare now that those opportunities are at a premium. If we look at the 2022-23 season, the major anomaly among recent campaigns, in which all 3 promoted teams stayed up, Southampton imploded with the disastrous appointment of Nathan Jones. Following years of gradual decline, Leeds were relegated in their 3rd season back in the Premier League after sacking Marcelo Bielsa, burning through 4 different managers in a single season, and making several bizarre recruitment decisions, and Leicester City were crippled under the weight of a massive wage bill full of high earners who they couldn't offload, compounded by long-term injuries to some of their star players. At some stage, that will happen again, and a newly promoted team will be able to capitalise. That much seems inevitable, but those instances are becoming few and far between, and the ability to capitalise, by winning, let's just say, 33 plus points, even rarer still. The result is a catch-22 situation, whereby scrapping parachute payments, which no one can deny wildly distort the championship and give clubs in receipt of them an enormous competitive advantage, resulting in extremely predictable outcomes in a division which supposedly prides itself on its unpredictability, would make it even harder for newly promoted clubs to compete in the Premier League, where they are already hopeless, because they wouldn't be able to significantly strengthen their squads without running the risk of financial ruin if they were relegated. But retaining parachute payments doesn't seem to make the promoted clubs anywhere near strong enough to compete regardless, whilst basically destroying the championship in the process. There are no obvious or easy solutions then. Well, except for making a better effort and being harder to beat, of course, but you can't expect clubs to show that kind of foresight and initiative all on their own. There also isn't any great motivation among the Premier League clubs to alter the system as it currently stands. Premier League clubs, as the division's shareholders, vote on how the league's income is redistributed, and it is in their own best interest to have lucrative parachute payments because it means that, should the worst ever happen and they get relegated, they will be the beneficiaries of that competitive advantage over everyone else in the championship. Even for those clubs who aren't at risk of relegation, and likely never will be, having the same clubs constantly being recycled between the Premier League and the Championship is in their best interests. As friend of the channel Kieran Maguire recently pointed out on social media, parachute payments are calculated as being 55, 45 and 20% respectively of the equal share elements of the Premier League distribution to its member clubs, which currently works out as £48, £39 and £17 million for relegated clubs over a 3-year period. However, if relegated clubs are promoted back into the Premier League, the parachute payments that they were due to receive aren't redistributed among the Championship or EFL clubs. Of course not, but rather, it is retained by the Premier League and distributed among Premier League clubs. Leeds and Burnley's automatic promotions from the Championship this season, while in receipt of parachute payments, save the Premier League £56 million. That is £56 million that will now be shared out between the Premier League clubs. Meanwhile, had Sheffield United also won against Sunderland in the Championship playoff final, Premier League clubs would have received an additional £39 million. Negotiations between the Premier League and the EFL as to a fairer system of redistribution have been ongoing for a number of years now, though they may be accelerated by the establishment of the Independent Football Regulator as part of the government's Football Governance Bill. Resisted by the Premier League, who aren't especially keen on anyone else regulating them, it remains to be seen how much teeth the IFR will have. The Premier League has been one of the UK's few major post-2010 success stories, from a commercial perspective, becoming a major global brand and a rare driver of economic growth. The government, therefore, whilst keen to safeguard clubs outside of the Premier League, will be fearful of killing what they perceive to be a golden goose. Within this catch-22 scenario then, where the dilemma is one between having an all-conquering top flight, which dominates the European and indeed global footballing landscape, but erodes almost any and all competition within the top 2 tiers of English football, and destroys the premise upon which the Football League pyramid was built, or having a weaker and less financially dominant top flight, but a more fluid and competitive pyramid, I am happy to kill the goose, or at least significantly maim it. Please can no one clip me saying that I'm happy to maim a goose. I don't want to have Peter coming after me just for a clumsy analogy. No geese were hurt in the making of this video. Where was I? Oh yeah. If the cost of making English football competitive and fun again is the Premier League no longer dominating every other top flight in Europe to such an extent that Fulham have a higher revenue than Ajax, then so be it. In fact, not just so be it, good. I don't want the entire landscape of European football to be dominated by a permanent settlement of 17 teams in a de facto Super League, who can only be challenged by about 8 other clubs from the entire rest of Europe, with a handful of vacillating clubs fluctuating perennially between the first and second tiers, while everyone else is left to rot or go out of business by taking wild gambles in a desperate attempt to try and disrupt the established order. I honestly don't think that is an especially hyperbolic description of the situation, or at least of where we're heading, but if we are going to decry the system as a whole, it is worth at least paying a cursory glance to the exceptions, and whether anything can be learnt from them. Of the 5 teams to survive out of the last 15 newly promoted clubs, 2 of them were parachute clubs, Fulham having had 5 successive seasons in which they were either promoted to or relegated from the Premier League, before comfortably surviving 3 seasons ago, and Bournemouth promoted at their second attempt following relegation under Eddie Howe. Leeds survived in style in their first season back in the big time under Marcelo Bielsa, but have since been relegated and then now promoted again. Nottingham Forest became the highest spending newly promoted team in history in their successful bid to survive, breaking the Premier League's PSR rules and incurring a points deduction as a result. And Brentford's survival was the culmination of Matthew Benham's 20-year master plan and probably the most consistently outstanding recruitment in English football during that time. Fulham had been relegated in each of their last 2 seasons in the Premier League, despite intense spending by American-Pakistani billionaire Shahid Khan, who is among the richest owners in the division. Those spending levels were maintained in the Championship, which meant that when Fulham finally did survive in the 2022-23 season, they didn't really have the budget of a newly promoted club. The Cottagers' wage bill, at £139 million, was actually larger than Brighton, Crystal Palace and West Ham's, and it boasted high-profile full internationals like Alexander Mitrovic, Joao Palhinha, and Anthony Robinson. The Fulham manager, Marco Silva, is also among the most capable in the division as far as I'm concerned, and had previously impressed in Premier League relegation battles with Hull and Watford squads that had smaller budgets and less talent than Fulham. Though Nottingham Forest weren't beneficiaries of parachute payments at the time, their survival could also be attributed, at least in large part, to intense spending. Promoted in the same season as Fulham but via the playoffs, Forest managed to ramp up their wage bill from £59 million in the Championship to £145 million in the Premier League in a single season, which is by far the fastest ever increase by a newly promoted club, and made Forest's wage bill even bigger than Fulham's, as well as the likes of Wolves, Palace and West Ham. Forest transfer expenditure, likewise, broke all spending records among newly promoted clubs, as they forked out £165 million net, which was the 4th most in the Premier League, ahead of Man City, Spurs and Liverpool. In terms solely of their budget, therefore, Forest actually underachieved in only finishing 16th, although, given the scale of the rebuild that was required following their playoff final win, the club understandably wouldn't see things that way. There was also a certain amount of fortune, or calculated risk, or a bit of both, in Forest breaching PSR limits in their debut campaign in the top flight in order to survive, and only suffering a points deduction the following season, by which stage they had further strengthened and 3 weaker Championship teams had been promoted, who all went down, despite Forest being docked 4 points. Whatever the ethics of what Forest did, as far as you're concerned, and different people will have different views on that, it isn't exactly replicable for most promoted clubs as a result. Leeds, Bournemouth and Brentford, by contrast, didn't simply, or at least didn't solely, spend their way to survival. Leeds invested heavily enough that they didn't have a bottom 3 wage bill, but only just, and much of their budget was thrown at their USP, Marcelo Bielsa. A unique manager within the context of newly promoted Premier League teams, Bielsa was a force of nature who transformed Leeds in a manner that, whilst not exactly impossible, would be difficult for too many other clubs and other coaches to ever replicate, and which, ultimately, either proved to be unsustainable long-term or Leeds made a terrible mistake getting rid of him, or, more likely, a little bit of both, leading to their eventual relegation. Brentford, by contrast, constituted, and still constitutes, a far more comprehensive long-term project, which has taken the Bees from the bottom half of League 2 in the late 2000s to the top half of the Premier League table, all under the watchful eye of Matthew Benham. Benham was previously an employee and associate of Brighton owner Tony Bloom, before the two went their separate ways, and Benham founded a rival data firm similar to Bloom's, making the pair of them sworn enemies. Brighton and Brentford's data-driven recruitment models, which have seen the pair of them majorly disrupt the Premier League, make them if not unique, since, there are 2 of them, then certainly exceptional. They are the only 2 teams who have managed to consistently and greatly exceed their spending power in recent seasons, but they operate models that are potentially only replicable if your club is also bought by Tony Bloom, someone who previously worked for Tony Bloom, or someone else who comes up with innovative and extensive proprietary data analytics software which can be used to gain a competitive advantage when it comes to recruitment. Bournemouth, therefore, provide perhaps the most interesting and the most replicable model when it comes to surviving, given that they stayed up with the third lowest wage bill in the Premier League, under the more modest managerial prowess and experience briefly of Scott Parker but primarily Gary O'Neill, and without suffering any tactical points deductions. Even then, however, Bournemouth had spent 5 of the last 6 seasons in the Premier League before winning promotion, and one could make the case that their survival was predicated on Bill Foley's mid-season takeover of the club, after which point he sanctioned £50 million of January arrivals. So has Premier League survival become impossible for newly promoted teams? The answer is probably not quite. At some point, a club will either be masterfully run, intensely bankrolled, or both of the above to such an extent that they manage to survive in the Premier League, most likely during a season in which one of the 17 established Premier League teams makes a catastrophic mistake, if not a series of mistakes. However, such occurrences have already become few and far between, and will become even rarer still as time goes on, and English football becomes increasingly divided not only by the divisions themselves, but by the divisions within divisions in terms of resources. I would go as far as to say that if Leeds, Burnley or Sunderland manage to survive next season, something which used to be a perfectly normal and mundane occurrence, that would be a more impressive achievement now than, for example, any of England's so-called Big Six winning either the Champions League or the Europa League. That is a radical transformation that has taken place within English football over a short period of time, and a depressing one, but the reality is that it suits the power brokers who own the English game just fine, and there is so far nowhere near enough pushback from football fans in this country, or a fall in interest and demand, that would force anyone to redress the balance. Well, either it's that, or they just need to make a better effort and be a bit harder to beat. It's got to be one of the two. Anyway, that is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. It would be foolish not to, really, both for this channel, HITC Sevens, and also my other channel, Alfie Potts Harmer, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on social media, usually via the username @HITC Sevens, and you can now support me additionally either via the Alfie Potts Harmer YouTube channel, where there are now channel memberships, or via buymeacoffee.com/Alfie Potts Harmer. But more importantly, I hope you all have a sensational day. Cheers. And don't forget to try hard. Always helps.